Hey everyone, so we're back again this week for another episode of the Corona Time podcast. This week we will be reviewing and discussing the 1979 Russian film Stalker. So this film was actually recommended to me by someone I met here in grad school in North Carolina. I don't really have permission, I haven't asked him to use his name, so I'll just refrain from using it. But I will say, just on sort of first reaction, this was I could see why he recommended it. This was a very interesting, unique film. It's the first foreign film that we've reviewed on our channel. And yeah, there's quite a bit to discuss and talk about on this film. So is there anything you wanted to say to start us off, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is our, episode 9, of the podcast. And I think, we've tried to pick films that have they're interesting stories, also something to talk about. But I think one thing I want to bring up, maybe in the beginning, is that if it's not well known, I mean, it's probably on the Wikipedia page, but I did come across, during my research that this film was actually filmed theoretically 3 times. It was, they shot it the first time. I can't remember who the cinematographer was, but the film ended up being grainy green, and then they filmed it again the second time, and it was a disaster. Apparently, Tarkovsky hated it and fired the guy. And then they filmed the third time, which is the one we'll see, is the third version. And what's interesting is that actually there's a handful of people, I guess, who are still alive that have seen both versions of 1 and 3. And they actually say that it's not that different. So actually, if put our mind at ease, that the version we are watching is very close to what the original was. But it also shows you that people forget that this is still during the era of the Soviet Union, especially now that we technically grew up without the Soviet Union. That and also in filmmaking there was a lot of revolution around the cameras and the film. So I didn't realize that the same the same type of footage he was using, which was still up and coming, is actually the same that will be used in films like Blade Runner, which maybe in the future we'll cover. And that because they were taking such a risk, they had these quirks, and also not even just with the filming, but also on location. They filmed in places of let's say old factories, energy plants, and a lot of chemicals. And it's sad to say, but they believe that a lot of the himself and also some of the actors died because of being exposed to that. I don't know if you knew about that, but so I just wanted to highlight that as much as we talk about how great this film is and how amazing it is, it did suffer a lot of technical difficulties, and one could argue it even cost lives because they weren't aware of either they weren't aware of the effects of these chemicals, or they just I'm assuming they weren't aware, because I didn't get the feeling that this was a propaganda piece, so they weren't forced. But I just wanted to highlight that. But I just want to highlight before we get into the nitty gritty. But I wasn't aware if you knew any of that history, that context. So
I actually did not know that context. I didn't really look into a lot of the background in terms of sort of location, or how Tarkovsky, who was a director, really wanted to sort of shoot this film in that sort of context. You can tell it's in many of the scenes, because there's a lot of it is trying to, I would say in my view, sort of portray a lot of locations as sort of a dystopia, especially in the beginning before they go into the zone. And you can see a lot of it was just really in sort of rough places within the city that were often kind of dumps. I mean, even when they do go into the zone, there's that tunnel that was just sort of littered with trash, and it's very dangerous. You can tell he really wanted to get that authentic feel of some of the dystopia on location.
Yeah, another little fun fact is that his wife wanted to be the casted as the wife of the Stalker, but he ended up not going that direction, and apparently she was insufferable on set because she wanted to be in the film. So I mean, I will say about to move on to now maybe the actual film. I just want to highlight that there's a lot of interesting little detailed stories on the periphery other than the movie that I think people will find fascinating and interesting, just because they'll give you a glimpse into his mindset, but also film production in the 70s and in the Soviet Union, and also like, you know, a bit of humanity of like, you know, people, you know, wanted to be in the movie, they weren't in the movie, they had a reshoot and it was annoying and the budget and all this stuff. So I mean, I personally like the stuff sometimes, you know, surrounding a movie. So I did find it that very intriguing. But I guess to start off with the actual film itself, before you know, before we get to the story, talking about some of the technical aspects, I did notice in this movie that the length of shots was pretty long. Like I think the average is like 88 seconds in this movie. And I think you and I are probably more used to modern films where like it's like, you know, quick. Sometimes it's very quick paced, or you know, even like long.
Yeah, sometimes a little too much.
Even supposed long scenes like in Birdman, they're really moving in a way that like they make it look like it's a single take, but you know there's some cuts here and there. But this is like sometimes I agree with you. Where like I'm watching and I'm like, wait, oh, we really haven't like moved scenes. Like we're just camera roll, you know. I was just curious about like what you thought about that because I think that plays into the length. One thing I noticed, like I knew there was gonna be a long movie because I saw the length, but you know sometimes long movies just have a lot of content. This one felt like it had a lot of, you know, non-dialogue, just soak it in, you know, enjoy the, you know, what he's shooting. Because I'm thinking of this one scene where like the characters are talking and then suddenly they go off screen, but the camera just stays there for like 10, 12 seconds, and it's just to give you a sense of the, you know, maybe the eeriness, like you said, the dystopia. I have read that like a lot of people don't like this film because it's so long, and also how long the shots are. And I do know that some people have criticized, and when he was still alive, like the film being so long. And so like, you know, a lot of like what's the meaning of like this long scene? Like you could have easily cut out like 10 seconds, you know. I was curious to get what your take on the length and maybe the style of the film, because I think that's very abrupt, and you notice that after like the first 45 minutes. You know?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to, before I sort of answer that, I just want to preface with some of my observation that I find it kind of interesting with just within the Russian culture that they tend to, from what I've known of several like Russian authors and commentators, they tend to tackle a lot of sort of existential questions. And this film is really no different. It kind of, Tarkovsky definitely wants sort of the viewers to think about a lot of different topics throughout this film. So I kind of find that really interesting. And within this film, one of the things that, to me, I found that Tarkovsky was trying to get across is that oftentimes, like, the whole point is that he's trying to guide them, you know, to the room. The room, and I'll say in quotations because you don't really know what it's sort of symbolizing. All you know is that once you get there, your sort of innermost true desire will be granted to you. And so he goes there, but immediately once they enter the zone, they're like, it's like, the room is like right there. It's not really supposed to be that far. He's like, but you can't go directly to it. You can't take that shortest path. You have to take sort of the long path to get to like your ultimate reward or desire, right? And so a lot of the way this film is even shot is, in my opinion, was just for metaphor and for effect. So even those long scenes, I felt like it was to drag on to the fact that, you know, to ultimately kind of get what you want or what you're desiring, you know, it takes a long time. And so that sort of idea of shooting like very long shots sort of gave that sort of metaphorical effect too. At least that's kind of like what my takeaway is. Now, for the reason why certain shots were longer than others, like there were certain, I remember like when towards the end of the film, the professor discarded a piece of the bomb, and you just zoom in and there's like a koi fish swimming around it, and it's just focused in on the bomb for, it was probably at least 30 seconds. And I'm just like, okay, is there like the point as to like why this specific frame? I can't really point to that. I think it was just to give the effect that Tarkovsky wanted by making the, you know, many frames, many scenes in this movie just sort of extended. That was sort of my takeaway. Was a lot of what he was doing was using things as metaphor. That was one of that's how I viewed his long shots. Just simply metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, this movie, I felt like the reason he had these long shots, because I'll be honest, at the beginning it threw me off because I guess I'm so conditioned to a certain type of filmmaking, even that are exotic. Like we did Tree of Life, and that was like edited like a masterpiece.
Yeah.
No, I felt like he was, in a sense, like Tarkovsky was like, this is my take. He was criticizing the dominant filmmaking culture of, you know, quick storylines. There's a, you know, even in high school I learned this, like, you know, the whole, you know, there's a setting, there's an initial arc of the hero's journey, and then, you know, the resolution. And I think in many ways
Mhm.
he was even in his own style, he was critiquing that, which I found it very profound. That like, especially now that we live in this hyper media culture of like instant TikTok, Instagram videos. You know, how
Yeah.
many people are actually going to sit there and watch like a minute of like a scene? They're going to be like, this is too slow. This is what is the point of this, you know? And I think he was definitely, the film itself is a critique on like modern society, but I think also, you know, even the film style is like, you know, you're going to sit here and watch because you already are in this hyper world of like information movement. And this is like in the, you know, in the 70s. You know, he died in like 86. I wonder what his, and it's a shame because I think he would have made some great films about definitely our today's culture if he was still alive, about like, you know, this modern social media, instant message, society.
Well, you got to understand too. It's a lot of sort of, I'm sure, like his style and his ideas were formed and framed in the fact that he sort of grew up in Soviet-dominated Russia, right? So a lot of the context with which we sort of, view certain things was different for him because we didn't grow up in sort of like a super like authoritarian regime where a lot of your rights are kind of limited, right? So it's just interesting seeing the sort of how the historical context and the society that he grew up in, how that sort of framed how he would make sort of art like this.
Yeah, that was definitely a heavy influence. I agree. And what's interesting is that he probably didn't like the Soviet Union because once he got to Italy, he didn't go back. But people forget that, like, and again, this is not the place to do a deep analysis of Marxism, but having read a decent amount of Marx, people forget that like what Russian people were told by Lenin, by Stalin in his own propaganda way was that Marxism was going to be the peak of historic, what they call historical, the historical material dialect, which is like, you know, after communism, the utopia will come. So people forget that like,
Mm-hmm.
even though like maybe in our society we view communism in a different lens of like, oh, it's regressive and whatever. I think for his Tarkovsky's generation, they were promised that this was going to be, you know, the last step before this, the perfect society, which is why I think he's also taking a critique of like a lot of the themes of modernity because his generation was told something and they grew up and they're like, wait a second, I don't see it, you know, like where is this magic, beautiful society we were promised, you know? So I think you're right. I think growing up in the Soviet Union, he he formed a worldview that like I would say is definitely different than maybe probably many filmmakers, American or what I would say Western, you know, would make. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how the sort of context with which you grew up with, how that really has an effect with you down the road. I mean, if you could take another sort of prominent figure who was influenced by growing up under the Soviet Union, you could take like Ayn Rand, and she was totally against any sort of philanthropy and um, collective viewpoint, where she went the complete opposite way. And that was totally sort of, in my mind, a response to having grown up in under the Soviet Union, under this collectivist regime.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a secondary example. Yeah, I mean, she was also somebody that I don't know off the top of my head. I'm actually curious if like they are actually part of the same generation or at least closest because like again like you know that generation was told like this is this historical materialism will lead to this utopia, but they might be similar like maybe she's a bit older than him, Tchaikovsky, but like yeah, you're right, like you know it's kind of like what we see today with like anti-capitalists, where like they see what's the issues in their current system and they're able to critique it very well, right? Like and they're able to say like, oh look, if we tweak this will be better and stuff, which not to get too like deep into the nitty gritty here, but I think you're right. I think it influences his style, it influences the message of this film, and even how like even the themes and stuff, which I know we'll get to. So I going back to the beginning of this movie, right? Like the first 45 minutes, like I mentioned earlier, that like I was a bit like, it took me a little bit to get into the rhythm of the movie because I think again it's such a contrast to what I'm probably used to. I found it interesting how like it's a bit on the nose, as I would say. Like okay, there's the stalker, the writer, and the professor. So you have reason, you have art, and then the stalker you could argue is like a priest-like figure.
Because
And
he's kind of showing you the path.
Yeah, and or prophet. I'll say prophet instead. But it's interesting because like some movies try to be very like obfuscating. Like oh, it's like symbolism on symbolism and stuff. And this is like I think it's pretty straightforward. That like these are the three characters. They're gonna go into the zone. And
I would say that I would say just to add something. This movie was laced with metaphor.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get is that like it wasn't trying to obfuscate the metaphor. Like even though the zone, we can talk about that forever, and the room, what it could represent, the characters themselves and their kind of dialogue perspectives, I think that was pretty straightforward. Like the professor had a certain viewpoint, so did the writer.
Oh, viewpoint, or the artist did.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
And
so did the priest.
Too. Yeah, but you're right. I think when it comes to like the zone and like when he's throwing I'm actually curious what you think the pebble throwing was. But those things, yes, I think there's a lot of metaphor and a lot of things that you can talk about for ages. So. But I thought actually the scenes were.
All right, so
go ahead.
So you were talking about the pebbles. Which point are you talking about when they would throw the nuts?
Yeah, the nuts. Sorry, yeah, the nuts. Like at first I was like trying to think like maybe my mind was working like what's the points of the nuts. Eventually I let it go like oh maybe it's like it's a like you said it's a tool to show like you can't just go like direct path. But initially I was kind of like oh this is interesting like he needs to throw this. But then I kept, honestly, when I was watching the movie, I was expecting like something to move or something, but like he would throw it and nothing would happen. They would just keep doing it.
The reason why he's throwing the nuts, as far as I understood, was to see if there are any traps around. Because he said in the zone, there's traps everywhere and you can never be too sure. So you throw it just to see if the it's kind of silly, right? Like throwing a nut, like you're still there's a ton of space in between where the nut lands, but I think it was kind of like a metaphor, just saying if like the path is clear, then you can proceed.
Yeah, I've read that like if you read the novel that it's based on, that stuff is actually explained more. But as a film viewer and having not read the novel, like that was my thought too. I was like, okay, maybe he's trying to trigger something. But like you said, like then they're walking through these stuff that like this thing did not even touch the ground on. So it's like I was a bit like confused, but maybe that's for like reading the novel. But
yeah,
how I viewed it, like you were saying, is that like my interpretation that I'm gonna go with is that like it was kind of a mechanism to show that like you have to follow he is the guide and you follow his rules and he's showing you the way to the room, so you have to kind of like you kind of have to have faith, which I know we're going to get into, but it's like you could say it's a metaphor of like how when you can have all these doubts about the priest, but like you have to assume that like what he's saying, he knows what he's doing. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, so I guess I wanted to ask you a quick question. There's one specific scene that I found quite striking. Was at one point the writer is sort of going on a monologue because at many points in the sequence of events when they're trying to get to the room, the stalker essentially tells the writer, you go first through the tunnel, through several different times. This is after the scene happens after they draw the matches, and the writer happens to draw, I think, the shortest or longest one, basically. Basically, he has to go first. And so he goes, and then once they reach the other room, he goes off on this monologue against the stalker, saying, you're selfish, you don't really care about us, and you sort of decide whether we sort of live or die. And then simultaneously, at the same time, he puts on the crown, and symbolically, I mean, it wasn't even symbolically, it was almost direct, what they were trying to get across, that he was sort of having that metaphor of him being like Jesus. I was wondering what you thought was sort of the purpose of that, or what he was trying to convey in that sequence.
Yeah, I think the writer, he is mocking that specific scene, but yeah, that whole sequence I love because like they draw the matches, and he gets I think it's the long one, but I'm gonna say short end of the stick as a euphemism here. And he goes through, and actually in that scene, what I like the most is that like he, you can feel the tension, right? That he thinks something's gonna happen, right? They get to this metal door, right? And he's just like, the stalker says, "Open the door," and he goes like, "What the heck, dude? Like, you want me to die, right?" And he actually pulls out a gun, if you remember.
Oh, and he tells him to drop the gun.
Yeah, he's just like, no, you can't. You're breaking the rules. No, you're gonna get killed if you use the gun. But obviously he brought the gun because he's like, yeah, he wants to make sure he lives, right? I found it fascinating that he took I'm going to say the leap of faith and dropped the gun. And then obviously you see later the stalker moved the gun like back deep into the water. But yeah, when you get to the whole sequence, when they get through that and then he wears the crown. Yeah, I think in the end he's like, he's mocking, because the writer to me represents kind of like comedy in a sense. Like, when you get to literature and you get to like maybe nonfiction, not nonfiction, sorry, fiction writing, often they try to use allegory, metaphor, euphemism to interpret society for the public, right? You think of the great works of like, trying to think of ones like Catcher in the Rye or Pride and Prejudice, all these like stories. You often look at these novels, they're trying to interpret the world for an audience, right? Like Little Women, like I'm just throwing random examples, but you can probably find a bunch. And I think the writer, yeah, he is mocking like the stalker, saying like, yeah, you're trying to be like this Jesus-like figure, and like, this faith stuff is overrated, and like, give me a break, like I don't. He's actually the one that questions the most. Like you said, why am I following the rules? I think with the professor, the reason he doesn't question as much is because in science or engineering or any profession that's more rules based, you understand the value of rules and principles, right? Like you don't start with like learning a certain like high level discipline without learning the basics of mathematics, chemistry, especially like whatever field that is, right? And I think that's why he's a little more willing, even though he has his own moment where like he recognizes that maybe this room is dangerous and wants to blow it up. But we can get to that later. But yeah, that scene to me represented like the writer doing what a lot of comedics do of like modern society, where like they are trying to basically make it a joke of maybe certain principles or certain things that we hold dear, and make us like have like the doubts, and second guess ourselves.
Yeah, I would say to your point with the professor, sort of like what dictates him is he's not necessarily unquestioning of the method that will sort of lead to their safety that was presented by the stalker, right? He's not like questioning of the method, whereas someone like the writer is like, is this the best method to kind of use? If that sort of makes sense. But I sort of want to harken back to that scene where he was wearing the crown of thorns that was, historically and religiously seen by like Jesus before he was about to get crucified. Where I sort of saw that was, and I agree with everything you said, but even more with, I saw it more with additional religious symbolism, because in many ways, the stalker sort of dictates, in a way, he has him take the risk and decides whether or not he's going to sort of live or die, right? And because he's like, no, I'm not going to go first. You're going to go first, right? And so essentially that decision puts his life in jeopardy. And he realizes once he gets, he's like, you don't really care about me. You just got to decide like my life by the fate. In many ways, in that case, he was sort of really viewing himself as Jesus. And in my mind, he was making the stalker be in a Pontius Pilate type role where he sort of decides the fate of the writer. And I found that religious symbolism a little interesting.
That's an interesting interpretation, because I remember this one line. I think the reason I didn't jump to it is because I remember the one line is like, how can you decide by straws? And yet the stalker says something profound about like, it was actually like, it was like destiny. Like you were meant to go first, like I forgot what the line was, but it was like, you chose to go first. It was very interesting. It reminds me of that religious, like kind of like symbolism.
Well, that was the faith aspect that the stalker holds true in many ways, or continues to hold throughout the film. But either way, he's still sort of.
Yeah, that's an interesting take with you're the sacrificial lamb and go first, So.
Right. Yeah, that's what I got from it, because he didn't know. He was just assuming that it was going to be like fate or whatever, but he didn't truly know of what was going to happen. Right, and so he said, you probably have the best, based on what's happened, right? He said, basically, when the writer sort of wandered off at the beginning of when they first entered the zone and wanted to go directly into it, nothing happened to him, right? He was given the warning, and so he thought, okay, based on that assumption, that nothing happened to you when you sort of deviated from the plan, that you would have the best chance.
Yeah, the writer has like some of the best monologues. I forgot if what scene is specifically. I don't know if it's when he's like, if he's talking like in the sand, like he's in the sand by himself. Remember in the sand, like he's walking by himself and he gets to the ring. And there's also other scenes too. But I remember one scene where it's very powerful where he talks about like his writing career and how like he wrote one good work and then like they wanted more. And then the pressure, he couldn't handle the pressure, right? He was going to the room because he wanted to find this high level enlightenment that like, you know, would ease this from himself. And I think Tarkovsky's taking a critique again of like modern society of like, you always need to achieve more. You always need the next promotion, the next big raise. You need more equity. You need more stock. You don't like you feel like there's this expectation, and celebrities probably have it the worst, right? Like, oh, you're this great musician. You need to have the next hit. You're this great NBA player. You need to win another championship. And obviously, like some of these people really do achieve, right? Like they really, you know, they do it. They win multiple. They do multiple records, but it is that like crisis of confidence, right? That like, you know, how much is too much, you know, and maybe like at one point you don't want to do it anymore. And I find his monologues surrounding that to be very profound. And I think something that like, I think a lot of people could take heed to today, where you feel all this societal pressure to be, you know, to be like, you know, have the greatest like vacations, have the really great, you know, family life, have the great job. Like you have these unrealistic expectations because you can't succeed all the time in everything, you know? Again, like this movie was this movie was totally right up my wheelhouse, man.
Yeah, no, I mean that monologue was great about like how, you know, you think that you're, even as a writer, that you're doing the service, that it's like you're writing as if like you'll help fulfill people in a way. He's like, but if I die, he's like, they're just going to go on to the next person. It was really a lot of questioning about him, what he's doing at an existential level. Was they have some of the best monologues that I've heard in a long time in this movie, sort of questioning a lot of these things. What I found interesting, or what I before I sort of go on to my take, what did you think that the room sort of represented?
Yeah, I think the room represented the possibility of transcendence. That's my take, actually. Like it's not a guarantee, but if you know, you are this, I'm gonna say Buddha-like figure, that you have if you enter the room, you have the possibility of transcendence. I think the whole wish thing is like, you know, I think it does happen where like, because I know like I think maybe you're hinting at this, where like the other stalker, he becomes rich and his brother dies, you know, on their journey, and you would think that his wish would be to revive his brother, but his deepest, darkest wish was to be rich. But I think that if your deepest, darkest wish is to like, you know, transcend the physical world and, you know, be a spiritual being, maybe like, you know, energy itself, that like you would get your wish granted there. But I think, you know, like I don't want to get to the end yet, but I think the movie is a critique of like, if we only focus on the material and also just like empiricism and all these things, that it won't get you there basically. But my take on the room was that I know that like they keep hinting the wish thing. I'm actually curious what your take is, but that was my interpretation.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I don't know if I've just seen too many like films with sort of religious themes or religious metaphor. Many ways, the room kind of reminded me of the story of like of Adam and Eve and eating from the tree of knowledge. In many ways, these people or whoever goes to the room, they're sort of yearning or wanting something. In the case of the writer, it was for his inspiration for writing. In the case of Professor, he kind of wants to blow it up, so that's sort of separate and apart because he views sort of the tree of knowledge. I'm using that as metaphor, or the room as just devastating, and people are going to use it for their own devices. He views it as sort of dangerous for society. But it's kind of interesting because it's like once they've sort of, they always talk about Porcupine. It was one of the previous Stalkers, though. And Stalker, I just want to remind that it basically means a guide, or like refers to people who guide others in the zone. But they always refer to Porcupine, and so he goes in and sort of goes into the room, and he gets all his wealth, but it's not really what he truly wants, or because it fulfills your innermost desire, so it reveals something that is not really what he expected, and ends up sort of, you know, out of guilt, he sort of kills himself. He hangs himself, in fact, because he did not even though he sort of says he wanted to save his brother, in the end he was just rewarded with wealth, which means that internally that's really kind of what he wanted. I viewed it more as like a metaphor for like knowledge. It's kind of like be careful what you wish for, in a way. Like you sort of serves as hope, but that hope can sort of be misplaced, and you might not get really what you're looking for in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I see your interpretation, and I think I would have probably like aligned with that, but I think there's some scenes after when we get towards. We'll jump around, but I guess we'll get to the end. But there are some scenes after that really switched my view to what I said earlier. Is because when the Stalker's talking to his wife, which I think are powerful scenes in the beginning and the end. You know, he says like, you know.
Oh, that monologue at the end was great.
Yeah, he says to his wife, like, look at their eyes. There's nothing. You know, and I think again, I think that's a critique of nihilistic behavior, because remember when he's on the bed and he's just like, you know, actually throughout the film he does a lot of like, I would say, prayers, like he's just going off on like, you know, very like, you know, metaphorical monologues, but you know, his wife is telling him to calm down, but he says like, you know, they didn't have faith, they just, you know, they chose not to enter the room. That's why I think like hopefully that's not for me. Somebody rang my doorbell. You know, I think that's why like hold up. Yeah, I think that's why like I have the view that the room represents like less tree of knowledge type analogy, but like transcendence, because it's a risk, right? It might like blow up in your face, like you said, like the tree of knowledge did. But I think, you know, if you at least try, then you at least tried something. Like, even though, like you said, that was a horrific, the death of the brother and then the money. But I found the ending to really change my view, because he's railing against them. He's saying, look, these people, they just, you know, they want to like stay only in the material. Like they don't even want to they don't even want to like even glint through the window of like what could this world be like. And I think that's why the ending is actually the mood is very somber. At least that's my interpretation. Like, I don't think the movie ends with a happy note. So.
No, it clearly doesn't. To me, I don't necessarily view, and I get where you're coming from, but I don't necessarily know if he comes with the most altruistic motives. Because in a way, sort of with the Tree of Knowledge analogy, one, they already knew what happened when Porcupine went into the room, right? I mean, it was clearly laid out. He ended up becoming wealthy, revealed something that, you know, he couldn't really live with, and he ended up killing himself over it. In many ways, the Stalker kind of reminds me of the snake in a way. I'm trying to get them to enter the room, take a bite from that Tree of Knowledge going in. And in the end, unlike Adam and Eve, they choose not to, right? Because they're sort of worried about what it may cost them. And you could say that's just them not taking faith, but it could be that could just lead them to madness in a way if they don't get sort of the answer that they are necessarily looking for. And the reason I say that his intentions aren't quite the greatest is because he says that he never entered the room, right, that stalkers can't. But from my interpretation, based on the ending, his daughter had sort of telekinetic, or you can argue if she had, you know, superpowers or not with the ending, some with being able to move the glass with your mind. And I choose to sort of go with that framework. And really the only way in my mind that she got that is that he went into the room and really thought that he was hoping for, you know, trying to cure his daughter from some of those ills that she was clearly suffering from, because she had some sort of physical handicap. And really what ended up happening was what he sort of wanted is not ultimately what he got. Where it's sort of like preparing for, it's really interesting with sort of the metaphor of the train coming by, because in many ways that seemed to me as to represent like after thinking about it for a little bit, to represent like the incoming future, how that's actually approaching, and what you're sort of doing or wanting, what you want may not necessarily prepare you for the future that's coming.
That's true.
I don't know. There's like a lot of like metaphor there.
I think the daughter, like how I viewed it is actually the daughter having telekinesis was like, I had the opposite view that like, if he did, I didn't think he went to the room, but like that's a good interpretation.
I think he did.
If he did, then I think that like I think the message there, if your interpretation is closer to the truth of the then I think no, I think actually it means that because he is, you know, he understood the humility of life, that like he was actually rewarded. You know how like God rewards those who are truly faithful. Because I think her ability gives her the ability now to not see her deformity as a curse, but like as a gift. So I think that honestly, I know I'm gonna say with my interpretation, the truly lost people is that professor and that writer. Like they are what I believe is what Nietzsche described as the last man. But in the end, they hide behind their intellectualism and stuff, but they're as empty as inside as they were after they wrote all these great books and read all the, you know, did all the scientific discoveries. Because I think there's something like in life that cannot be quantified by just how much money you have or how much like degrees you attain or anything like that. So I think again, I think Tarkovsky is like he's nailing. I love this movie, dude. He's just nailing like exactly the things that I do think that are getting lost in modern society.
So it's good, and I agree with you. I just don't know if there's more there that he was trying to convey than exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just like this movie was so open to interpretation in many facets, and it's trying to get you to, it's leaving out certain things and trying to get you to think that certain scenarios may or may not have happened.
Yeah, I mean,
which is where it gets interesting.
I agree with you because I've read that like this movie is what we're doing now as actually not what Tarkovsky wanted us to do, like, you know, over analyze it, but it's like a movie that you watch, you experience, and then, you know, you yourself like have like an internal monologue, you know, versus like, you know, let's dissect every scene or like the style and like the themes and stuff. Because I think he really wanted the movie to be more of a personal, like a mirror, like into your own, like question your own you know, your perceptions about life and society and, you know, your own personal philosophy.
Well, in a way, we all have our own unique takes, and I think that is formed because we're our own people. So, like, you have your interpretation, I have mine. We're trying to, like, hash it out, trying to see, like, you know, if we miss something that someone else might have gotten. So, I mean, I do agree with you. I just, in that, really, the scientist and the writer, they really don't have the faith at all. But in many ways, like, you can't necessarily blame them because they know what happened to previous people who went into the room. That being Porcupine. I mean, they clearly illustrate his story for a reason there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to highlight that, like, it's not a guarantee. Like, even if you're like, you think you're a good person or reasonable, I think one of the myths that I think people have had is that, like, if I do everything right, I'll be rewarded. And I genuinely do believe that people should do their best to do everything like correctly, like at least morally. But often, like everybody hits that question, right? Like, oh, you see this, you know, this beautiful person or family, then suddenly they tragically died, and their family's devastated, and you start wondering, like, what the heck? Like, there's so many other people who like act like, you know, very evil, like greedy, viciously, and they're not punished at all, right? So you're right, like it's existential questions, right? You start thinking like, why? So I think they're all battling that, like, you know, do I enter, do I not enter? Because I think in the end, what happens is I think they themselves don't think they're ready to enter. They're afraid, right? And so they're like, no, and then they don't. And even the professor. But I want to get to the professor eventually because I found his decision interesting. How he decided in the end not to blow it up. I'm curious about what your take on that was. But
I don't know. So before we sort of get into that, I sort of want to, I guess, like make the analogy. It's like I've read a decent amount of like Carl Jung, and what they were doing a lot. For those of you who don't know, he's a psychologist during the, I want to say like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But it's a pretty famous psychologist who did a lot of work on sort of dreams and dream states and psychoanalysis and that. But some of the other work that he was sort of critiquing or interested in was work regarding sort of psychedelics. And in that time, you know, it's really, I've never done any psychedelics, but from people that I've talked to or sort of read about online, you know, everybody's trip is sort of different. You, in a way, metaphorically, you're sort of entering a room that you don't really know what's going to happen, what's going to go on, right? And a lot of sort of religious traditions, like the many Native American religions here, they would use that to sort of go or psychedelics to go on certain vision quests, right? Because it might give you answers that you previously wouldn't figure out like on your own in sort of the normal world here. In many ways, that kind of reminded me of the Room when I was watching this movie. But something that I was sort of always kind of struck me about Jung, because he was very interested in a lot of these sort of what dreams sort of represent, as well as what happens when you go on these trips. Said, be careful of because you can always have a bad trip. Some people have very good positive experiences when they undergo psychedelic trips. Some people can have very bad ones. In many ways, what his advice was, he's like, be careful of unearned wisdom that you may gain from this. Sort of, if you're not ready, then you might not like the answers that are revealed when you undergo a trip. In many ways, that sort of, even though that's sort of more real world example, and it's very sort of metaphysical, very, very much reminded me of like what was sort of going on. It's like, if you enter the room, you may not be ready for the answers that might be unveiled to you.
Yeah, I mean that's what happened to many characters, right? Supposedly in their dialogue, that they didn't go in and then leave without like what they thought they were going to gain, right? Which is why I think that most would fail, right? I think it takes like probably certain high level, like I mentioned earlier, Buddhist like figures to like probably hit that transcendence,
reach the highest level of enlightenment.
Yeah, what I find interesting is that like and the only reason I'm sticking with that is because like all the other evidence and dialogue, it seems like it's a critique of like the professor or the writer. So like I think The Room is just, like I said, it's vague enough to keep probably talking about it, because like it can mean a lot of different things. Even the zone, like why is there only the room exists in the zone and stuff like that. But I want to get to the professor real quick. Oh, go ahead.
So getting to the professor, it sort of goes on. I would say that if he was truly lost or against what you're saying, that he's trying to rail against sort of faith and hope and all that the room represents, he would have blown it up in my mind. And he chose not to, which means in some way he views the idea that the room represents, that being of hope and sort of belief, he views that, he changes his mind and kind of views that as somewhat sacred in a way, like keeping it intact and not going
that's what I found interesting, is that he just like he switched positions, and like how like there is dialogue, but like the artist has like, the writer has like really rich monologues, and I didn't get the same sense with the professor, so I was kind of like trying to piece together like sorry, go ahead.
In many ways, he represents what the typical sort of scientist sort of sees as a world as kind of like black and white. At least I think that's what they were trying to represent, the two sort of viewpoints in which they see the world. And in many ways, he calls like the professor naive at like the beginning. And then the Stalker, he really does have sort of that priest mentality when they're on their journey, and he talks about how music's and everybody's interpretation of music sort of transcends, even though it's just a bunch of sounds that are put together in some way that we see, it sort of resonates within our hearts and minds in a way that, isn't really that explainable.
Yeah, I will say that was a great monologue. Yeah.
Yeah, with music, and I've had that view of music for quite a long time. But what I will say is that sort of counters your point, because even though they didn't enter the room, they didn't blow it up, because I think they viewed that it's good for people to have hope in something. And that's where I didn't truly agree with completely with the monologue that the Stalker had at the end, where they completely lost and have faith. Because if they were truly lost, then they would not have just not entered the room. They would have blown it up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like that's one thing I was like thinking, like, why didn't he really blow it up? But like, yeah, he had this switch of position, but it was as if like, yeah, like he had, like you said, like having some type of hope is better than none. But also I feel like go ahead.
Sorry, just real quick before you go on. To add to that sort of point that the zone, and more specifically the room, represents hope, you can really see it in that when they're in the real world, it's very grungy, dystopian looking, and they even add sort of that reality by the way it was shot with a sort of, I don't even know what coloration it is, but it's in that sort of brown, grainy-ish sort of tinge that most of the film at the beginning is shot with. But once they enter the zone in the room, it's all in color, like completely. So they clearly wanted to use those sort of filters as more metaphor or more adding to the point. And that's a technique that's been used since that. I mean, this was in '79, but it's been used in several films that we reviewed, that being Do the Right Thing and American History X, to add to more symbolic effect.
I will say that, like, if we're gonna go further with your analogy that room represents hope, then why didn't they at least, if they didn't, I guess they didn't have hope then, like they didn't want to step in, you know, like they didn't feel like they were ready. Like I can find the validity in that argument of like, oh, the room represents hope, but then like if they were truly people of like who could take the leap of hope, I'm not gonna say leap of faith, you know, they would have at least entered. But like you said, they did like the middle path of like, we're not gonna destroy, like I'm not gonna blow it up, but I'm not ready, or I don't want to like step through the door, you know?
I think it's because within them too, they didn't view themselves as ready to. I think it still keeps hope in their minds, but at that point they weren't ready to accept it. But more so, I think they were not willing to blow up other people's hope, or what that could represent.
Interesting, yeah.
Right, and I think basically the sort of sequences or scenes, the talking through what the professor was going to do. Eventually, he was convinced that it was not a good idea to blow it up.
Yeah.
Despite how dangerous it could potentially be. I don't know, there's a lot. One other thing I was kind of curious, I don't know if you put this this part of the film, I don't know, I can't quite figure out like if there was any bigger meaning behind it. What did you think the dog represented?
That's a good one, because I was also curious about like the dog. Like it followed them, and then even the stalker took it home. It honestly, like I actually don't have a really an answer for you, because like I was still confused about that after I watched it. Like honestly, like I the only interpretation I found while I was watching was more of like the dog represents like the passive voice of like either a spirit or like nature itself, like, you know, the fourth wall type of thing. Like, you know, it's watching like these powerful personalities argue and debate and go through this journey, but like it's not like I couldn't, like I don't know any analogies off the top of my head of like, you know, what does this like, you know, dog slash fox like creature like could it represent something, you know, like there's no like, I mean, I don't, maybe I don't have the knowledge, but there's no like, I can't think of any like Greek or any like clear metaphor for it. But there probably is, maybe in Russian culture could be. So I know that
yeah, there
like,
could be,
and dogs are important in Russian culture. So
I mean, I agree with you. Because I mean, this is obviously shot for like a Russian audience too, even though it went international. So some of the like more symbolic things could have just been more for Russian culture, which I'm not super familiar with. So yeah, I was trying to figure it out. I was like, well, what does this mean? Because even at the beginning, they hear the bark, right? And they're trying to figure out what it is, but really it's just that dog, and he follows them throughout the zone. But yeah, I couldn't quite figure it out. Maybe he represents some sort of like guardian angel, if you will, of sorts within it, but that's about the only thing that I could somewhat think of.
yeah. The one scene that I also found powerful, and I know we haven't mentioned her enough, but like the stalker's wife, she has scenes in the beginning and the end, but I found her monologue at the end to be very profound, where I think this is very, I don't want to stereotype and generalize people, but this sounds very Russian, where she says, you know, I'd rather have a bitter happiness than a dull life. And I was thinking like, oh, you know what, that is like, you know, it's better to have like some friction in life, ups and downs, and just to be, you know, kind of like, you know, always hitting the 6 out of 10.
But have everything the same.
Yeah, which is interesting because
well, in many.
Oh, sorry, I'll finish my point. Because what's interesting, if you watch some of our, like, especially we haven't done it yet, but if you watch like a lot of American films in like the 50s and like maybe like a generation ago, like what we call the golden age, supposedly, you know, you see that the archetype is same house, everybody has the same picket fence, you know, everybody has the same family structure. Like the dull life is a bit romanticized.
There's no uniqueness.
Yeah.
In many ways, I view that sort of monologue as almost a critique of the Soviet Union at that point, in that really a lot of the themes have to do with sort of freedom, and they chose to go to the zone, but in many ways you sort of have the sort of two sides of the coin, that being sort of like freedom or like kind of paradise, because that's sort of what the zone represents as like utopia. And she said, in the end, she's like, I could have, chosen someone else, had sort of a dull life. In many ways, it would be sort of paradise because there'd be no ups and downs with it. But she's like, I chose you. I chose to be with you. I chose that freedom. And I knew sort of, but it was of my own volition. I knew what comes with it. I knew it wasn't always going to be perfect, but it was still sort of my choice. And I think that was sort of a critique on what the Soviet Union had always promised, in that Soviet Union, promised this within their doctrine of communism, Marxism, that paradise would come, utopia. But within that, you sort of took away people's own personal freedoms within it, and that was sort of what she ended up deciding to sort of pursue, was, marrying the Stalker. And in that way, she chose freedom over that sort of quote unquote utopia, as dull as it is.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think Tchaikovsky did take some hits at the Soviet Union for sure in his own way.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. But I think bring it over to our society. I think it is a bit of a, because you can take the same analogy and put it to like some of the things that American society has romanticized, and often it seems cookie cutter. And I think you're right. Like I think especially with Soviet Union life, that everybody knows that it was very, like as a we grew up in a capitalistic system, so we're so used to like supposedly choices and stuff. And I don't want to get into like it's becoming like a monopoly, but you're right. Like it's supposed to be like a transition point to the utopia, and that like everything will be provided for you, everything will be fine. But like it doesn't coin with like human nature, human desires, right? Like if everybody has the same picket fence, I mean, I think people who come from more of a religious, I'm not religious, like I'm not like super hardcore like Catholic doctrine, but I think people who understand like kind of like that's, well, my whole point is that I think like really hardcore Marxists, I think they're missing that point, that like if everybody has the same picket fence, there's going to be that one person that's going to be like, I want a bigger fence. I mean, it's just going to happen, like, and then you have all this like world reality.
More what I found interesting was she was talking about how her mother in the dialogue sort of told her not to do it. You knew what you were kind of getting into. But honestly, if you want to take sort of, because we both watched this show recently, Dave, if you follow, for those of you who don't know, Dave is it was based on this rapper named Lil Dicky. It was sort of loosely based on his rise in genre of music called rap. And essentially what's pretty interesting with him is, unlike I would say a lot of people within hip-hop, is that he sort of came from he's a white Jewish rapper, but he came from a middle-class background. And before entering the music industry, he was in marketing at a job in San Francisco, where if you look at interviews, it says, yeah, it was a good job. It was a pretty comfortable life. But he's like, and everyone, once he made the decision to sort of pursue rap as a career, he's like, I got a lot of pushback from people. He's like, it wasn't sort of the conventional choice. And he's like, but I knew what that sort of plan would lay out for me. He's like, I just love hip hop too much. And you can see it throughout the show that it's loosely based on that he sort of went through ups and downs. But he's like, I wouldn't necessarily have it any other way, despite the fact that I would say most people would say, why wouldn't you take or stick with the marketing job? That's a certain choice. It may be dull, but at the end of the day, it'll sort of get the job done, and that'll be your quote unquote utopia. At the end of the day, you chose sort of the hard road of going and pursuing his dreams within the music industry. Sorry, that was just an analogy, and it's just that I feel like some people could see, like if you see a story, it's more interesting that you would. I feel like most people would choose sort of the bitter quote unquote happiness than than just a dull, mundane life, even though that might be the easier road to take.
I was gonna say that I think most people in our society takes the other choice. I think they choose.
I guess it depends. Yeah, you're right.
I think they choose a dull life because I think when you're young you take more risks, right? And you don't think much about the consequences. But I think where I give Dave a lot of credit that it's hard to actually do that like mid career because it takes a lot of effort and you have that social stigma of like what are you doing,
Yeah, you know what? I take it back. I do agree with you. I would say that at a certain point, especially, you sort of quote unquote give up on your dreams, even though that would be like because that's sort of the harder road to take.
Yeah. I do like your Dave analogy. It's a great show, by the way. Putting a plug there. I think this movie. Yeah, I mean it touches on all these little points that like you could keep like dissecting like for ages. But yeah, I think you're right about like that monologue at the end is a good one. I mean, there's a lot of monologues in this movie. It's funny how like most of the movie probably isn't long-winded dialogue, but like the ones that are really like hit you, it really does like get you there. Like you can tell it's a movie.
Yeah, they were great. It was.
Yeah.
They were really well scripted monologues in this film. Some of the best I think I've ever seen in a film.
I agree.
But yeah. Anyway, yeah, the biggest question I had was just pretty much the dog, because everything else was, you could have many different interpretations. That sequence of events with the dog started falling, and that kind of was like, all right, where is Tarkovsky really going with that? Well, like, why is he putting that into the script? But
yeah,
I don't think either of us had a really good answer for that.
I know I didn't. There's a. Yeah, I mean, this movie is like one that like it gets you thinking, and it's actually, like I said, other than the initial like 30, 45 minutes where I had to adjust to the style, like it's a movie that like it's truly enjoyable especially after the first hour. I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's overrated, it's too long, it could be shorter. And maybe if I was from a different generation, I would actually be like, oh yeah, it could be like 30 minutes shorter. But now that I definitely have grown up in this hyper instant gratification culture, I have more appreciation for this than I think if I had like just, I was like my mother's generation or something like that. So, because I can see a lot of people going like, oh man, like, this could have been cut like by 30 minutes,
everything he did was pretty deliberate, I will say. It's not like despite some of the scenes being a little long, I didn't feel like they were necessarily needless. In the same way that I felt like when I watched The Wolf on Wall Street years ago, I thought, man, I know we brought that up before, and not that it was a bad movie, it's just you could have cut out 30 minutes of it, because a lot of it didn't necessarily add to the... I felt like if you had cut out 30 minutes, I still would have taken away what I got out of the film. It wouldn't have, you wouldn't have cut out anything for the audience. But within this film, everything that Tarkovsky did, I felt like he did deliberately.
The one thing I'll say about The Wolf on Wall Street, I do agree with you. I do know that Scorsese did say that like he wanted to film it in a style that represented the themes, which was abundance and excess. And I think, I can't remember if he said this, maybe he didn't, but I think the insinuation was that the movie was extra long also thematically for that reason.
Yeah, but the issue I had with that is he beat you over the head. He beat you over the head with that theme, and like they showed throughout that film the opulence and the lifestyle that these traders were living. And it's like, okay, that like, sorry for going off tangent, but there was a scene where he's like driving the Lamborghini while he's stoned out of his mind. It's like, is that really necessary? No.
Great scene. That's a great scene, dude. I love that scene. I know people that probably live by but I agree as a whole. Like I remember, because my barometer is always at the end, dude. I feel like, because usually you always think, oh man, like I'm at the end finally. So like when I have that thought, that's when I know that like in my mind, I say like, okay, this movie was, in my opinion, a bit too long. But I didn't have that. I feel like it's a slow beginning, but like once it got into it, it was just like, oh wow, it's over. Like dang.
I would say once it got to part 2 is when it really picked up, which is about an hour in, and then it's like, man, it was really good from then on out.
Which is interesting because I remember reading that like Tarkovsky did say like his in his mind it was going to be 2 films, but it ended up being 1.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting observation there, that you brought up, that like part 2 and part 1 they feel a bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was good though. I mean, there was a lot of themes to talk about within the plot of the film, and yeah, I mean, I feel like we dissected pretty much all of it. I mean, there was a lot to sort of go through and parse. But anyway, do you have any other final thoughts?
No, not really. I mean, we can get into the scoring and stuff if you want, but yeah, I mean, I thought this movie. It's been a long time. Well, actually, what's funny, on my own time, I watched a movie that really hit me, but this movie, I feel like, really like it aligned nicely with a lot of my own worldview. So I will say that.
I can see that. Well, anyway, yeah, we can. Unless there's anything else, we can get on the rating system.
Sure. So I personally like this movie a lot more than Do the Right Thing. So, and I know I gave that a pretty high score. I'm gonna
You
say
gave that, I believe, a 9.
Yeah. So
you gonna give this a 10?
No, 9.5 out of 10.
Oh, okay.
10 has to be like a master. Like it has to be a movie that like I would be like, this movie is so good that like if you hate this movie, I'm gonna be disappointed.
So I really like the commentary. My one knock is just sort of the slow start of the film, and I know it was done deliberately. It was just didn't really grab your attention quite like other films do at the beginning. Even though, despite the fact that it picks up a lot throughout the film, I'd probably give this a 9. One of the other things I want to touch upon that I thought the acting was very good in this film, a lot. My one issue is when the beginning, the husband, the stalker, leaves, and then the wife kind of has a breakdown, and she falls out of the chair, but her breakdown was not very believable to me.
Yeah, it seemed kind of like of the time, right?
It was
like,
forced. Yeah.
Yeah, because
I was like, man, it's not gonna.
If you watch some old films, it's like, wow, like acting, they really worked on this craft. Like some things are like, they look good.
Yeah.
Like if I watch like old action scenes, it's like actually kind of funny because like, I mean, not this film because there's no action, but like if you watch, like if I would do like a film of the 50s, they'll do this punch and it'll look so fake. It'll look like he's punching air and then they just add the sound of like peach. I'm like, what the heck? We've definitely come a long way, at least in terms of like some film sequences of like
acting ability.
Because like, yeah, if you watch 50s action, it's like I forgot that the old Adam West had like the pow pow. I'm like, what? Like nobody's gonna do that.
Pow, wham, pop. Yeah, all of the. Oh my gosh, what is that word that describes like when you say like a word that describes a sound? It's not onomatopoeia. It's
I forgot.
Can't think of it, but you know what I'm talking about. It's killing me that I can't think of the word. Anyway, so because of the slow start, I give it a slightly lower rating than you do.
That's fine. I mean, I will say this, like I've seen reviews where it's like 1 out of 10, and I'm like, come on, like really 1 out of 10? Like I think that
1 out of 10, people just don't get it.
No, but I will say this, I think that people are putting 1 out of 10, and often they say it's the meaningless scenes and extended takes. They actually probably fuel Tarkovsky's point about like, oh, that's your issue with it. It wasn't like cut in nice 10-second edits, Like if you say like,
the crispness.
I will say this, the kind of interpretation I could see, if you want to say it's 5 out of 10, 2 out of 10, if you said, you know what, I think his perspective on faith is wrong. That like faith just causes people to accept their situation, not better themselves, and like, oh, magic, institutions, and know your place in know your place in the hierarchy. If you had that interpretation and you rejected the movie that way, I could understand a low rating. But often I see it's too long, or what the heck, why do these take so long? So, which I think you're missing the point of why. But I think if you had a more anti-religious perspective of the movie,
or
like anti-spirituality, I won't say religious, anti-spirituality like take on the movie, and that was your critique, I could respect a very low rating if that was truly what the perspective was, because I could see that point of view. You know, I could understand the 180 of my own take. So,
I gotcha. Yeah, I think just overall we both really enjoyed this film. It might not be. I would ask you this: would you recommend this to most people?
Well, I would recommend this probably to my family, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend it to like just a guy I met at work or something.
I feel like if you don't understand the context and the fact that this was, you know, that the director grew up in the Soviet Union, this is like a very commentary heavy film and very metaphorical, then you might not enjoy it as much. You kind of have to understand the context with which it was made to really get a lot out of the film. But yeah, overall, I think we both enjoyed it. And yeah, any last words?
No, I'm good. I think we got everything. It's a great movie. Watch it, please.
All right, yeah. I mean, I think we would both, if you are sort of, if you like films with a lot of like metaphor or touch upon a lot of existential themes, you will definitely enjoy this film. You just have to sort of get through some of the long takes, even though that's commentary that Tarkovsky was trying to get across as well. But yeah, if you enjoyed our commentary on this film Stalker, please like and subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for our subsequent episodes that will be coming up in the coming weeks. So take care.